He clears throat. The eviction was a quiet affair, which made it worse. There was no shouting, no struggle, just the damp chill of a late autumn morning and the finality of a signature on a piece of paper. Elias stood on the porch of the house his father had built, a house that smelled of sawdust and forge smoke and 50 years of living. He held a canvas sack containing the sum of his inheritance. A heavy claw hammer, a set of cold chisels, a hand drill with a worn wooden handle, and a small oilskin-wrapped book of his father's diagrams. Everything else, the house, the smithy, the quarter-acre of land that bled into the woods, now belonged to Mr. Silas Croft. Croft stood by the gate, a man built of soft living and hard money. He did not look at Elias. He looked at the house as if measuring it for new curtains. His coat was thick wool, his boots polished leather. He was a man insulated from the world by layers of wealth. "The debt is settled," Croft said to the heir. It was a statement of fact, like noting the color of the sky. The debt was a phantom, a ledger entry from a decade ago that Croft had bought for pennies and allowed to fester with interest until it had grown large enough to consume a life's work. Elias said nothing. His father had warned him about men like Croft. "They don't build, son," he'd said, his voice raspy from a life of coal dust. "They just own. They trade in paper and they think paper is real. But the ground has a long memory. The stone has a long memory." The townspeople of Hemlock's Hollow watched from a distance. They stood in small, silent clusters by the general store or peered from behind their own curtains. They were good people mostly, but their lives were entwined with Croft's ledger. He owned the mill. He held the mortgages. He controlled the flow of everything in and out of the valley. To stand with Elias was to stand against the current, and the current was cold and strong. Their silence was a form of complicity, a quiet, regretful turning away. "The forecast calls for the Widowmaker by week's end," Croft noted, finally turning his gaze to Elias. It was not a warning. It was a pronouncement, a flourish on his victory. "I'd find shelter if I were you. The woods are unforgiving." The Widowmaker was the name they gave to the first great blizzard of the season, the one that swept down from the northern peaks without mercy, burying the land in a shroud of white. It was the storm that culled the weak and the unprepared. To be caught out in it was a death sentence. Elias looked past Croft toward the jagged line of the mountains. The peaks were already disappearing behind a veil of bruised gray clouds. The wind carried a new kind of cold, a wet, biting cold that promised ice. He pulled the collar of his thin coat tighter. He had his father's tools, and he had Patches, the old sway-backed mule who now stood tethered to the fence, watching the proceedings with weary, intelligent eyes. He slung the sack over his shoulder. The weight of the steel was a familiar comfort. It was real. It was not paper. He walked to Patches and untied the rope. He did not look back at the house. To look back was to give Croft the satisfaction. As he led the mule down the dirt road and away from the only home he had ever known, he felt the first delicate touch of a snowflake on his cheek. It melted instantly, a cold tear that was not his own. The townspeople watched him go, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and relief. The problem was no longer theirs. Elias and his mule were now a matter for the woods and the coming storm. He walked for hours, climbing higher into the foothills that rimmed the valley. The snow came faster now, thick, wet flakes that clung to the branches of the pines and turned the world into a monochrome sketch. The path grew faint, then disappeared altogether. The cold was no longer a sensation. It was an entity. It seeped through his worn boots, through the thin fabric of his coat. It was a thief, stealing the warmth from his blood, the strength from his limbs. Patches plodded faithfully behind him, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She was the last living link to his past, to his father. They were a small, lonely island of life in a world that was rapidly freezing over. He knew he could not last the night in the open. The wind was picking up, moaning through the trees, tearing at him with invisible claws. Desperation began to gnaw at the edges of his stoicism. It was a cold fire in his gut, a frantic energy that threatened to consume his resolve. His father's face swam in his memory, the lines around his eyes, the soot permanently etched into his skin, and with the memory came the words. Faint at first, then clearer. Men build things for reasons that make sense at the time, his father had once mused, staring up at this very ridge. And when the reasons are gone, the things they built are called follies. But a thing is just a thing. It's what you do with it that matters. Folly for them, maybe. But iron remembers heat. Elias stopped. He looked around, his eyes scanning the snow-dusted landscape. He was on the old logging ridge, a place long abandoned. The trees were thinner here, the ground scarred and rocky. And there, half buried in the earth and draped in a blanket of fresh snow, was the folly. It was a colossal iron cylinder, lying on its side like a fallen god of a forgotten age. It was the boiler from a steam-powered lumber mill that had gone bankrupt 70 years ago. It was massive, 30 feet long and at least 10 feet in diameter. Its surface, a tapestry of deep orange and brown rust. A monument to failure. He had seen it 100 times as a boy. A strange, ugly thing on the side of the mountain. A place for ghost stories. But now he saw it through his father's eyes. He saw not a relic, but a resource. He scrambled toward it, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He placed a bare hand on its curved surface. The cold was shocking, so intense it felt like a burn. It was the deep, ancient cold of inert metal. But it was solid. It was a shield against the wind, which now howled with renewed fury. One end of the boiler was sealed, a great circular plate studded with rusted bolts the size of a man's fist. The other end was open, a dark, gaping maw. He peered inside. The interior was a cavern of cold, dark iron. It smelled of damp earth, rust, and the faint, musky scent of animals that had sheltered there long ago. It was not a home. It was a hollow iron tube on a frozen mountain. But it was a chance. It was a glimmer of hope in a world that had offered none. He led Patches to the opening, and the old mule, sensing a respite from the wind, went inside without hesitation. Elias followed, stepping out of the storm and into the profound, echoing silence of the boiler. The wind shrieked outside, but inside its voice was muffled, a distant complaint. The immediate biting assault was gone. Here the cold was a still, heavy presence, but it was a passive cold, not an active one. He took a deep breath. The air was frigid, but he could think. He could plan. He dropped his sack of tools onto the curved floor. The sound of the metal clanking against metal was loud and sharp in the confined space. This was the starting point. His father had given him the knowledge. Croft had given him the motivation. The mountain had given him the iron. The rest was up to him. The work had to begin now. Music, his first priority was to close the opening. A shelter with a mouth that wide was no shelter at all. It was just a cave for the wind to inhabit. He needed a wall. He needed a door. He left the relative calm of the cylinder and stepped back into the storm. The snow was falling in a blinding curtain now. He could barely see 20 feet ahead. He began his search, his eyes scanning the ground for the only building material the ridge offered in abundance. Stone. He found them half buried in snow and frozen earth, the discarded rubble from the mill's foundation. They were heavy, awkward, and slick with ice. He used a chisel and hammer to break the frozen ground's grip on the larger ones. Each strike was a shock that traveled up his arm. His fingers, already numb, burned with pain. He worked methodically, without pause. He found a stone. He tested its weight. He carried it to the boiler. He set it in place. He went back for another. Patches watched from inside, her ears twitching. He started at the bottom, laying the largest, flattest stones he could find as a foundation. He did not have mortar. He had to rely on gravity and friction. He fit them together like a puzzle, turning them, testing their stability, seeking the most secure purchase. The smaller stones he used to fill the gaps, chinking the spaces between the larger blocks. He built the wall inward from the edges of the opening, leaving a narrow gap in the center, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. It was slow, brutal work. The sweat on his brow froze into a crust of ice. His muscles screamed in protest. But with each stone he laid, the wall grew. With each stone, the shelter became more real. He found the rhythm of the work. He found the focus. The cold existed, the pain existed, the storm existed. But the work was what mattered. The wall was what mattered. Hours passed. The dim light of the afternoon began to fade into a deep, stormy twilight. By the time he could no longer see the stones in front of him, he had a wall that was 5 feet high, a rough but solid barrier of interlocking rock. It was ugly, but it was strong. The wind now hit the stones with a dull thud instead of rushing inside. He found a large, flat slab of slate that had once been part of the mill's floor. It was too heavy to lift, but he managed to tip it on its side and, with agonizing effort, lever and drag it into position to serve as a crude door. He could lean it against the opening, sealing the final gap. Exhausted, he stumbled back inside the boiler. The darkness was absolute. He fumbled in his pack for a nub of a candle and a tinderbox. His fingers were stiff and clumsy, but he finally managed to strike a spark. The tiny flame flickered to life, casting a small, dancing circle of light on the curved, rusted walls. The space was transformed. It was no longer just a dark hole. It was a room. His room. The stone wall was a dark, formidable presence, a testament to the labor of the last few hours. But it was still desperately cold. The iron walls seemed to suck the heat from his body, from the very air itself. Shelter was not enough. He needed fire. He needed warmth. He remembered the ruins of the foreman's office, a collapsed wooden shack 100 yards from the boiler. His father had scavenged parts from it years ago. Perhaps something remained. Taking the candle, he pushed the slate door aside and ventured back out. The storm was a living thing now, a white beast of wind and snow. He fought his way to the ruins, the candle flame shielded in a tin can. The shack was mostly gone, its roof caved in under the weight of past snows. But there, in a corner, half buried in debris, was a small, pot-bellied stove. It was made of cast iron, rusted but intact. Its legs were broken, but the firebox was sound, the door still on its hinges. It was a treasure. It was the heart of the system he was beginning to build in his mind. Getting it back to the boiler was a new ordeal. It weighed over 100 pounds. 100. He cleared the debris from around it, then wrapped it in his blanket to give him a better grip. He dragged it, inch by painful inch, through the deepening snow. The sound of it scraping over the frozen ground was the only thing he could hear besides the wind. He hauled it through the doorway and into the center of the cylinder. It was a black, dense object in the candlelight, a promise of heat. But a stove was useless without a chimney. A fire without a flue would fill the space with smoke and kill him as surely as the cold. He went out again. He searched the wreckage of the mill, his candle a lonely star in the blizzard. He found what he was looking for. Sections of old flue pipe, discarded and forgotten. They were dented and rusted, but they were whole. He carried them back, his arms aching, his body screaming for rest. Inside the boiler, he examined the ceiling. High above the spot where he'd placed the stove, there was a large circular fitting where a pressure valve had once been. The valve itself was long gone, leaving a perfect, round hole to the outside world, about 6 inches in diameter. It was his exit point. He fit the lengths of pipe together, using strips of cloth from his spare shirt and mud from the floor to seal the joints. He hoisted the assembled chimney into place, wedging the top end through the hole in the ceiling. He secured the base to the stove's outlet. The final piece was fuel. He had seen a cluster of dead, dry pines standing near the boiler, their lower branches shielded from the snow. He took a small hand axe from his sack and went out one last time. He chopped at the dead limbs, the sharp crack of the axe a defiant sound against the storm's roar. He gathered an armful of the dry, resinous wood and carried it inside. He arranged the kindling inside the stove, his hands trembling with a mixture of cold and anticipation. He struck a spark. The tinder caught. A small flame grew, licking at the larger pieces of wood. He closed the stove door, leaving the small draft vent open. He heard a low rumble as the fire took hold, and then a satisfying whoosh as the draft began to pull up the new chimney. He held his breath, watching. A thin tendril of smoke curled from a poorly sealed joint in the pipe, but the vast majority was being drawn upward and out. He sat on the cold iron floor and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The little stove glowed red, throwing off a meager circle of heat, but the immense mass of the boiler remained frigid. The iron was drinking the heat, absorbing the energy with an insatiable thirst. He fed more wood into the fire. He leaned back against the curved wall, his body shivering uncontrollably. Doubt crept in. Was it too much? Was the mass of iron too great for the small stove to overcome? Had his father been wrong? And then he felt it. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible. The section of the wall directly behind the stove was no longer leaching the warmth from his back. It was still cold, but it was a neutral cold. He pressed his hand against it. It was not warm, but the shocking, painful cold was gone. Section. He scrambled to his feet and moved along the wall, touching the iron. The warmth was spreading, a slow, creeping tide of thermal energy. The iron was beginning to breathe. It was taking the fierce, concentrated heat of the stove and radiating it gently into the space. A profound sense of triumph washed over him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first victory. He had taken a collection of forgotten, rusted junk and imposed his will upon it. He had built a system. He had shelter. He had fire. He leaned the slate door into place, sealing himself in. The roar of the storm became a distant whisper. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady breathing of the mule. In the soft, warm glow of the stove, he laid out his blanket, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to him. He was not in a house. He was in the belly of an iron beast he had tamed. And for the first time since leaving his home, he felt safe. If you've stayed with the story this far, you're about to discover why his first victory was also the seed of a new, more dangerous failure. Elias awoke to a strange, persistent dripping sound. He sat up, disoriented. The fire in the stove had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and the deep, radiant heat he had reveled in had faded, replaced by a damp, clinging chill. The air was heavy and thick with the smell of smoke and wet rust. He lit his candle. The flame revealed a dismaying sight. The upper half of the boiler was slick with moisture. Droplets of water clung to the rusted ceiling, growing heavy before falling with a steady plink-plonk onto the floor below. His blanket was damp, the air was hazy, and a thin layer of soot coated every surface. His throat felt raw. He understood immediately. The warm, moist air from his own breath and the burning wood had risen, hit the still frigid metal of the upper cylinder, and condensed. The water was running down the curved walls, pooling on the floor. And worse, the smoke was not drawing properly. The chimney was too short, the draft too weak. The fire was suffocating, and it was slowly filling his new home with poison. His first system was a failure. It was a temporary solution that had created a new set of problems. Problems that were just as deadly as the cold outside. The stove burned through wood at a prodigious rate, yet the warmth it provided was fleeting and uneven. The far end of the boiler, near his stone wall, was still bitterly cold, an icebox untouched by the fire's influence. The shelter was not sustainable. It was a damp, smoky trap. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold. He had worked so hard, pushed his body to its limit, only to find himself in a situation that was slowly killing him. The storm still raged outside. He could hear its muffled fury. There was no escape. He stood up and began to pace the length of the cylinder, his mind racing. He could quit. He could let the fire die, open the door to the blizzard, and accept his fate. The thought was a brief, seductive whisper. But then another voice, his father's voice, cut through the despair. Heat is a river, son. You don't just dump it in a pond and hope for the best. You have to guide it. You have to tell it where to go. Every good forge, every good chimney, it's all about the flow. Observation over panic. That was the lesson. He stopped pacing and began to observe. He watched the lazy curl of smoke that escaped the pipe fittings. He felt the air currents with a wet finger. He saw how the condensation was worst at the highest point, farthest from the stove. The problem was not a lack of heat. The problem was distribution. The hot air was rushing straight from the stove to the chimney, doing a poor job of heating the space, and an even worse job of heating the great mass of the boiler itself. It was an inefficient, wasteful design. He was pouring energy into a leaky bucket. The failure had roots. The flaw was hidden inside the solution itself. He needed to make the heat linger. He needed to force it to travel, to give up its energy to the iron along a much longer path. A memory surfaced, a diagram his father had drawn for him in the dirt floor of the smithy years ago. It was a design for a Roman hypocaust, a system for heating a bathhouse from below. They knew how to move heat, his father had said with reverence. They used stone and air, the simplest things, the smartest things. A new plan began to form, more ambitious and more complex than his first. He would not just heat the air, he would heat the entire structure. He would turn the floor of the boiler into a giant radiator. He let the fire die down completely and pushed open the heavy slate door. The blizzard greeted him with a wall of white, but his purpose was renewed. He had a new problem to solve, a more elegant problem. Section-section. He spent the next 2 days in a blur of intense, focused labor. His first task was to gather more materials. He needed flat stones and lots of them. He fought his way through the deep snow to the ruins of the mill, where he used his chisel and hammer to pry up sections of the stone flooring. He dragged them back to the boiler on a makeshift sledge built from the remnants of the foreman's shack. He also needed clay. He remembered a small, spring-fed creek down the slope from the ridge. He dug through feet of snow until he found the creek bed. The water was still flowing sluggishly beneath a layer of ice. He broke through the ice and scooped out handfuls of thick gray clay, packing it into his sack. It was freezing work, his hands turning into numb, useless claws. Back inside the cylinder, he laid out his materials. He carefully dismantled the chimney pipe. He moved the stove from the center of the floor to a new position, much closer to his stone wall and the door. Then he began to build. Using the flat stones and the wet clay as mortar, he constructed a long, low channel that snaked from the outlet of the stove. The channel was about a foot wide and a foot high. It did not go straight up. Instead, it ran the entire length of the boiler, a serpentine flue laid directly on the iron floor. It traveled from the front to the back, made a U-turn, and came all the way back to the front, where it finally connected to the vertical chimney pipe that vented through the ceiling. It was a painstaking process. He had to fit each stone perfectly, sealing every joint with a thick layer of clay to make the channel airtight. His father's words echoed in his mind. No leaks. A leak is a thief. It steals your draft, steals your heat. He worked by candlelight, his fingers raw, his back aching from crouching on the cold iron. The deeper lesson was becoming clear to him. It was a system of interconnected parts. The fire, the flue, the mass of the iron, the air itself, they all had to work in harmony. His first attempt had been a blunt instrument. This new design was more like a musical one. Section-section. He also realized he needed to control the flow of air into the system. He chiseled a small, low-level hole in his stone wall near the floor. This would be his air intake. It would provide a steady, controlled supply of cold, oxygen-rich air directly to the stove, creating a powerful and continuous draft that would pull the smoke through the long, winding channel. After 2 days of constant work, the new system was complete. The serpentine channel of stone and clay looked like the fossilized remains of some ancient serpent resting on the boiler floor. It was a physical manifestation of his father's lesson. With a sense of profound trepidation, he rebuilt the fire in the stove. He lit the kindling and closed the door. He held his breath. For a moment, a puff of smoke came back out of the stove's air vent. His heart sank. Had he miscalculated? Was the channel too long, too complex for the draft to overcome? Then he heard it. A low, deep hum began to emanate from the stone channel. The draft had caught. The fire roared to life, much stronger than before. The system was breathing. He placed his hand on the stone channel near the stove. It was already growing warm. He moved down the length of the boiler, following the serpentine path. The heat was traveling. The stones were absorbing the energy from the hot smoke passing within them. The entire floor was becoming a source of heat, section-section. An hour passed. The transformation was astonishing. The cold, damp chill was gone, replaced by a deep, pervasive, and utterly comfortable warmth. There was no smoke. The draft was pulling every wisp of it through the channel and out the chimney. The condensation on the ceiling vanished as the upper walls of the boiler slowly warmed up. The heat was radiant. It rose from the floor, warming the air, the walls, his own body. It was a gentle, bone-deep warmth, completely different from the harsh, direct heat of the open stove. And the system was incredibly efficient. The fire in the stove burned steadily, consuming far less wood than before, because so much of its heat was being captured by the stone and iron instead of being wasted up the chimney. He had done it. He had not just fixed the flaws. He had created something far superior. He had refined the system. He had taken a failure and, through observation and the application of deeper knowledge, built a resounding success. That night, he baked a small loaf of bread, a mix of flour and water he had brought with him, on the hot stones of the channel cover. The smell of baking bread filled the warm, dry space. He shared a piece with Patches, who chewed it gratefully. Perv. The blizzard could rage all it wanted. He was safe, He was warm. He was home. The boiler was no longer a shelter, it was a habitat. He had achieved a state of quiet mastery over his environment, using the simplest things, stone, clay, iron, and fire, to defeat the brutal force of the winter. The days that followed settled into a comfortable routine. The storm continued unabated, a constant white noise outside his iron shell. Inside, a quiet domesticity took root. The system he had built worked perfectly, requiring only a steady supply of wood to keep the boiler at a constant, pleasant temperature. He spent his time improving his living space. He used the remaining lumber from the foreman's shack to build a raised sleeping platform, getting his blanket off the floor. He built a small table and a stool. Each cut of the saw, each strike of the hammer, was a deliberate act of creation, of making a home in the most unlikely of places. The boiler itself became a tool. The warm, dry air was perfect for seasoning the pine he gathered, making it burn hotter and cleaner. He learned the nuances of his heating system, which parts of the stone channel were hottest. The section nearest the stove was hot enough to boil water in a tin cup. Further down the line, it was the perfect temperature for slow cooking the rabbits he began to catch in small, simple snares set near the edge of the woods. He was no longer just surviving. He was living, and living well. He had food. He had warmth. He had shelter. The bread existed. The stew existed. The shelter existed. These were not abstract concepts or paper claims. They were the physical reality he had forged with his own hands and his father's knowledge. He found a new kind of peace in the isolation. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire, the contented chewing of his mule, and the distant howl of the wind. It was a silence that allowed for thought. He would sit for hours, running his hands over the rough tools his father had left him, feeling the worn wood, the balanced weight of the steel. He felt closer to his father here, in this strange iron house, than he ever had in the home Croft had taken from him. He was not just using his father's tools. He was inhabiting his father's wisdom. One morning, nearly 3 weeks after the storm had begun, he awoke to a different quality of light. It was a brighter, clearer light filtering through the chimney pipe. The ceaseless roar of the wind had died down to a whisper. He pushed aside the slate door. The world outside was transformed. It was a landscape of impossible beauty and stark silence. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpting the ridge into new, soft shapes. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The storm had broken. The sheer depth of the snow was staggering. In places, it was piled up to his chest. The valley below was a sea of unbroken white. No smoke rose from the chimneys of Hemlock's Hollow. The town was buried, silenced. A flicker of concern touched him, but it was distant, a problem for another world. He spent the day digging out, clearing a path from his door to the nearby stand of pines. The work was strenuous, but the crisp, cold air felt good in his lungs. He felt strong, healthy. A few days later, he saw movement on the ridge below him. It was a lone figure, struggling through the deep snow on crude snowshoes. The man moved slowly, erratically, as if exhausted or injured. Elias watched him for a while, a strange reluctance to re-engage with the world of men holding him back. But the figure stumbled and fell and did not get up for a long time. Elias knew he could not simply watch. He pulled on his coat and made his way down the slope, his boots sinking deep with every step. As he got closer, he recognized the man. It was Jed, an old trapper who lived alone in a cabin on the far side of the valley. Jed's face was gaunt, his beard caked with ice. His eyes were wild with desperation. "Help me," Jed croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "My cabin, roof collapsed. Been walking for 2 days. Lost." Elias said nothing. He simply helped the old man to his feet and, supporting his weight, began the slow climb back to the boiler. Jed was delirious, muttering about the cold, about being buried alive. He seemed unaware of where he was being led. When they reached the boiler, Elias pushed open the door. A wave of warm, bread-scented air washed over them. Jed stopped dead, his eyes widening in disbelief. He stared into the warm, softly lit interior, at the glowing stove, the sleeping mule, the neatly stacked firewood. His gaze traveled over the serpentine stone channel on the floor. He could not comprehend what he was seeing. "What? What is this place?" he stammered, his teeth chattering. "Am I dead?" "No," Elias said quietly. "You're safe. Come inside." He led the bewildered trapper into the warmth and sat him down on the stool. He gave him a cup of hot broth, and then a piece of the bread he had baked that morning. Jed ate like a starving animal, his eyes darting around the space, trying to make sense of it. He touched the warm floor, then the gently radiating wall. It's impossible," Jed said, his voice filled with awe. "The whole valley is frozen solid. People are burning their furniture to stay warm. Croft's mansion, they say, his well is frozen. His chimneys are cracked from the cold. And you, up here, in this thing." Elias simply nodded, adding another piece of wood to the stove. He did not need to explain. The reality of the warm, secure space was its own explanation. It was a fact, solid as the iron around them. He had created an island of summer in the heart of a frozen winter. Jed stayed for 2 days, recovering his strength. He spoke of the devastation in the valley. The Widowmaker had been worse than anyone had imagined. The snow had been too deep, the cold too persistent. The town's preparations, based on normal winters, had been woefully inadequate. They were suffering. People were cold, hungry, and afraid. Croft, for all his wealth, was as helpless as anyone else. His money could not buy warmth when the firewood was damp and the coal was gone. His arrogance had provided no insulation against the relentless cold. When Jed was strong enough to travel, Elias gave him a small sack with bread and cooked rabbit. He showed him the safest way down to the valley. "They won't believe me," Jed said as he prepared to leave, shaking his head. "They'll say I've gone mad from the cold." "It doesn't matter if they believe it," Elias replied. "It's here." Jed looked at him, a new respect in his eyes. He was the first witness. He had seen the impossible made real. He nodded slowly and began his descent, a man returning from a different world. Word of Elias's survival spread through Hemlock's Hollow like a ghost story. Jed, the first witness, told his tale at the general store to a huddle of shivering, skeptical townspeople. He spoke of a warm iron cave on the mountain, of fresh-baked bread, of a young man who had not just endured the storm but had mastered it. Most dismissed it as the ramblings of a man who had spent too long in the cold. It was easier to believe Jed had lost his mind than to believe Elias had performed a miracle. But the story planted a seed of doubt, a nagging question in the back of their minds. The town was in a desperate state. The relentless cold had exposed every weakness in its infrastructure. Chimneys failed, pipes burst, and food stores dwindled. The grand manor of Silas Croft was no exception. His large, drafty rooms were impossible to heat. His servants were sullen and shivering. The veneer of his authority was cracking under the simple, brutal pressure of the cold. He heard the rumors of Elias's survival and scoffed. It was an insult to his own suffering. "The boy is dead," Croft declared to anyone who would listen. "Frozen solid in some ditch. It's a fool's tale told by a frozen fool." But not everyone was so quick to dismiss it. The town blacksmith, a man named Ben, had known Elias's father. He knew the old man had been a tinkerer, a man who understood metal and heat in a way no one else did. He listened to Jed's description of the stone channel, the stove, the draft. It sounded strange, but it had the ring of practical truth. Ben gathered a small group of men. They were tired of being cold. They were tired of Croft's blustering incompetence. They fashioned snowshoes and, armed with a healthy dose of skepticism and a sliver of hope, they began the arduous trek up to the logging ridge. They found it just as Jed had described. A wisp of clean white smoke rose from the top of the massive iron cylinder, a clear sign of a hot, efficient fire. As they drew closer, they could feel a faint aura of warmth in the air around it. Elias heard them coming. He stepped out of the boiler, blinking in the bright snow glare. He stood before them, not as a victim, but as the master of his domain. He was healthy and calm. He simply waited. Ben, the blacksmith, stepped forward. He was a large man, his face grim. He peered past Elias into the warm interior. He saw the ingenious setup. His blacksmith's mind immediately grasped the principles at work: the controlled airflow, the thermal mass, the radiant heat. It was brilliant. It was elegant. It was something he had never imagined. "Your father?" Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. He would have been proud. The other men stared, humbled and ashamed. They remembered their silence on the day of the eviction. They had stood by and watched this young man be cast out to die, and he had not only survived, but had thrived in a way they could barely comprehend. He had done it with the very knowledge they had all collectively forgotten or dismissed as old-fashioned. Elias did not offer recriminations. He did not gloat. He simply invited them in. He shared his warmth and his food, demonstrating a grace that shamed them more than any angry words could have. He showed them the system, explaining the principles of the Hippocaust, the importance of the draft, the way the iron stored and radiated the heat. He was not hoarding his knowledge. He was sharing it. Their visit did not go unnoticed. Croft, seeing the expedition head up the mountain, was consumed by a mixture of fury and disbelief. His ownership had been challenged. His narrative of Elias's demise had been proven false. He gathered his 2 hired men and followed, determined to reassert his authority. He arrived to find the townsmen sitting inside the warm boiler, listening intently as Elias explained the design of the serpentine flue. The sight of this cozy, functional community inside a piece of what he considered his scrap metals sent him into a rage. "What is the meaning of this?" Croft boomed, his voice echoing in the cylinder. "This is my property. This is my land, my iron. You are all trespassing." Elias looked at him, his expression unreadable. The townsmen looked at Croft, then at Elias, and their allegiance, once bought by fear and debt, shifted. "This ridge was never on your deed, Croft," Ben the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble. "And this boiler was abandoned by the mill company 70 years ago. It's salvage. It belongs to no one. Or it belongs to the man who made it a home," another man added. Croft's face turned purple. His claims were paper. His authority was a social construct. Here, on this frozen mountain, those things meant nothing. The only authority that mattered was the authority of competence, of the practical knowledge that created warmth from fire and stone. He was powerless. The very system he had used to dispossess Elias, the law, the deed, the paper claim, was irrelevant in the face of the physical reality Elias had built. "Get out of my boiler," Croft sputtered, his threat sounding pathetic and absurd even to his own ears. No one moved. Elias simply turned back to the blacksmith. "The key is making the channel airtight," he continued, as if Croft were not even there. "You have to use good clay." Defeated and humiliated, Croft stormed away, his hired men trailing behind him like shadows. His power, built on paper and intimidation, had dissolved when confronted by a simple, undeniable truth. A warm room is more real than a legal document. That day marked a turning point for Hemlock's Hollow. The men returned to the valley not just with a story, but with knowledge. Guided by Elias and led by Ben, they began to retrofit their own homes. They built smaller, simpler versions of the Hippocaust system in their own hearths, creating more efficient heating that saved wood and drove the damp chill from their houses. Elias became a teacher, not a hermit. He shared the diagrams from his father's book, translating the old, forgotten wisdom into practical solutions that benefited the entire community. He had not sought revenge on Croft. He had achieved something far more profound. He had achieved vindication through competence. His moral superiority was demonstrated not by punishing his enemy, but by saving the community that had once shunned him. The boiler on the ridge remained his home, but it also became a symbol. It was no longer a folly, a monument to industrial failure. It was a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of knowledge passed down through generations. It stood as proof that true value wasn't in what you owned, but in what you knew how to build. The ground has a long memory, his father had said. So does iron. And now, so did the people of Hemlock's Hollow. They would not soon forget the lesson taught by the young man who slept warm in the belly of the beast while the world outside froze. Music. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Frontier Chronicles and consider becoming a paid member of our channel.